For today's meeting, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Andrew Abdalian, who will share some of the challenges and successes during the creation, editing, and publication of the Tunica Language Textbook by the Tunica Language Working Group. Andrew has a BA in linguistics from Swarthmore College and a PhD in linguistics from Tulane University. He works on language change and pedagogy in endangered and reawakening languages. He's worked with the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana on revitalization of the Tunica language since 2016, and he is currently the NACE postdoctoral fellow here at the APS. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Andrew. Welcome.
Tohalapu, ima Andrew Abdalian etisa, eesh Rowintaworu Luhchi Yoroni, lefpitan nikakja, kana ukmash iti. Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Abdalian, and today I'm going to explain how we created the Tunica Language Textbook. I'll be discussing some lessons learned from the experience. I'd like to start the talk by acknowledging the many people who worked to create this book. It was a collaborative effort lasting over a decade, and it had been underway for over 3 years when I got involved. It is the work of many hands, hearts, and minds. So to outline the talk, I'll start, as I usually do when I talk about anything related to Tunica, with a little background on Tayonik, the Tunica people, and Luhchi Yoroni, the Tunica language. And then I'll talk about Kuhpani Yoyani Luhchi Yoroni, the Tunica Language Working Group, which is a collaboration between the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe and Tulane University. And then I'll get into the textbook itself, the philosophy that guided its creation, how we went about creating content, editing that content, typesetting that content, and publishing it. My hope is that some of what I talk about today will help language communities thinking about creating their own language materials. So to start, the Tunica people are a Native American tribe, are a Native American tribe in the lower Mississippi Valley. They went through southward migration in stages along the Mississippi River. They were close allies of the French, and they're currently located in central Louisiana on land that they received from the Spanish government in the 1700s. You can see here the trajectory of Tunica migration. The Tunica-Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana is, as I said, a tribe in Louisiana. Tunica language is one of the 5 heritage languages of the tribe, which is an amalgamated tribe of Tunica, Biloxi, Ofo, and Avoyelles. They obtained state recognition in 1975 and federal recognition in 1981, and they have about 1,800 enrolled members. The language is an isolate. Like so many indigenous languages, it was subject to linguistic pressures, certainly from European languages, but also likely from Mobilian trade language, which was a language of wider communication in the southeastern United States. The last known native speaker, Sososri Uchigon, died in 1948. But before the last native speaker died, it was documented by 3 separate speakers working with 3 linguists. So the first of these was William Eli Johnson working with Albert Gatchett in 1886. In 1910, John Swanton verified some of what Gatchett had gathered and also gathered 2 stories from Volson Cheeky. In 1930 and 1931, he returned to Louisiana and worked with Sososri Uchigon. And between 1933 and 1938, Mary Haas worked extensively with Sososri Uchigon to create the documentation that serves as the basis for much of the revitalization effort. And a non-exhaustive history of Tunica revitalization effort. So in 1948, Sososri Uchigon died. But in 1964, Chief Joe Parite wrote to Mary Haas requesting copies of her work. Tribal members shared stories with the wider community and recorded songs that they remembered in the 1960s to the 1980s. Donna Parite did a lot of work using Mary Haas's materials to create Tunica language curricula in the 80s and 90s. She continues to work on the revitalization of Tunica as a member of the Tunica Language Working Group, and I'm happy to say that she's here today. And the Tunica Language Working Group is the collaborative collaboration between the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe and Tulane. So the Tunica Language Working Group is just the latest in a series of revitalization efforts. And it is community engaged research, which is best described by Gerald Baldwin and his co-authors in 2022 as a framework that seeks and nurtures community involvement, leverages community knowledge, and is led by community need. These are some pictures from the collaborative efforts. In the top right is a picture from the Winter Immersion Program, and the bottom right is a picture of the Tunica Language and Culture Summer Camp. Those, for me, are the two highlights of the year. When I worked for the tribe, they were what I most looked forward to, and I look forward every 6 months to going back to Marksville to participate in these events. This is an informal organizational chart of the Tunica Language Working Group. A staff linguist in Marksville serves as a sort of liaison between the two collaborative partners. Dr. Rebecca Moore currently holds that position. These are some of the pedagogical materials we created between 2010 and 2023 when the textbook was released. So an online dictionary, children's books, coloring books, Tunica games. Those are the projects we worked on prior, and those gave us a good idea of how to sort of, design some sorts of pedagogical materials, but certainly I don't think anything as ambitious as the Tunica textbook. So now that you have a little bit of background about the language and how the revitalization project is organized, we'll talk about that textbook. Here's a brief timeline. The creation of material for the textbook started in 2012. We submitted a proposal for publication to Indiana University Press in 2018 and submitted our final draft of the textbook in 2022 and was published in May 2023. So what were we doing during all that time? Let's start with goals. The main goal of a textbook may seem obvious, but it's worth stating explicitly. We want to create a textbook that can be used to learn the Tunica language as a second language learner who knows nothing about Tunica. Simple, right? So where do you start? Thankfully, we had a little bit of a leg up because we had a model to work from. Dr. Judith Maxwell, who was one of the original points of contact for the project and has worked on it since its inception, has worked on Ketchikel revitalization for decades. And the teaching methodology from that revitalization served as a model for the method we use for teaching. So Rowintaworu, the Ketchikel textbook she co-authored, was a great point of departure. Here is a couple of pages from that textbook, and then a few pages from ours. You can see that they work sort of similarly with a vocab list, dialogues, a grammar section, although our grammar sections tend to be a little bit more involved, and then exercises. And in ours, we also used, we have a cultural section for each chapter because a language and a culture are inextricably intertwined. And so we needed and wanted to include culture in the teaching of the language. So now I'll talk a little bit about the pedagogical method. The basic is a 5-step process. There's 2 extra steps you can add on to the end. So you present the material via dialogue, and then we use what's called total physical response. So you start out, the second step is having the students respond to the vocabulary with some sort of physical action, like pointing at something, touching something, or acting out the vocabulary item. And this is followed by eliciting yes and no responses, and then responses that use previously learned vocabulary, and then having students respond with the target vocabulary. So this is the pedagogical method that we had in mind when we were creating the textbook. But even though we use that as a starting point and we use similar teaching methods, the Tunica textbook had different needs due to the different situations of the 2 languages. Most notably, Ketchikel has 500,000 native speakers, while Tunica has none. So while Quechua is taught by first language speakers, Tunica is taught by second language learners. And as a widely spoken language, Quechua is fairly stable linguistically, while Tunica is still, I would say, in flux as it continues to be refined in use by the community of second language learners, as well as by the working group. So I thought about calling these problems, but I decided instead I'd be a little bit more neutral and call them considerations. We need to come up with guiding principles. How do you standardize a revitalizing language? What audience are you aiming this at? How do you make content and what content do you include? How do you order that content into chapters? How do you maintain consistency when there are so many authors? What sort of software do you use to make it in terms of collaboration and, as it turned out, typesetting? And how do you go about publishing it? So in terms of guiding principles, we have two main ones. One is we want it to be easy to learn, and we want it to be as true as possible to the historical documentation. But these are sometimes in conflict, as Tyler Whitaker notes in their master's thesis on the Tunica revitalization efforts. There's always the question of what will be easy, accessible, and transparent versus what is authentic, justified, and true to the source material. So to give you a brief example of that, the Tunica number system is base 10. So what is the word for 31? The word for 1 is sahku. The word for 3 is eniku. The word for 10 is michu. And the word for plus, or add to, is teya. So 31 with Tunica word order gets put into 10, 3, 1 plus. So michu, eniku, sahku, teya. But the form in historical documentation is michu enikteya saku. So you lose the ku from eniku. So in modern Tunica pedagogy, what do we do? Do we follow what's attested in the historical documentation, or do we add that ku back in to make it a little bit easier to see all the components of the word? And in this case, we chose to put the ku back in, so michu enikkuteya is how we write it in the book. And this is for what we call morphological transparency, so that everything is just fully there so people can see what it's composed of. We also have to worry about standardization. A very simple and early example is choosing an orthography. These are the differences in orthographic standards that the three linguists who worked with Tunica used. You can see there are quite a few differences, and even some that were missing from the first two because they did not either hear it as an independent sound or didn't think to write it differently. So these are the three proposed transcriptions for modern Tunica. The first was by Pam Monroe, who was a student of Haas's. Donna Parit contacted her in 1998, and she came up with a proposal for an orthography. The biggest problem was standardization around vowels. Tunica has 7 vowel sounds, and English only has 5 characters for representing vowels. Early on in the revitalization, we used, you can see that Pam Monroe used diacritics for some of the, so used an umlaut over the E for the A sound, and then an umlaut over the O for the open O, the all sound. Early on in the revitalization, we used an EI to represent A as in bait, and an E to represent E as in bet. But we later decided, the group later decided that using the epsilon that Haas used and the open O would be the way to do it. As you can see, we eventually borrowed most of it from Haas's transcription methods, but made it a little more English-like by using the digraphs of CH and SH instead of using diacritics on C and S. Again, this is a decision that may seem simple, but it's one we had to change when learners found the EI versus E to be confusing in terms of the sound. Who are we writing for? Is it for children, adults, teachers or learners, people familiar with grammatical terms or not? With this one, we never really made a firm decision. We came up with things like it's for everyone, or people should be able to use it without a teacher and be able to learn Tunica. Both of those are tall orders, writing for everyone and writing for anyone to be able to learn Tunica without any sort of guidance. And also remember that most of the authors were grad students in linguistics, and getting grad students in linguistics to not use linguistic terms that not everyone may be familiar with is incredibly difficult. It's also very difficult to describe the sort of nuances of a language without introducing some sort of new terminology. So though we tried to make it more accessible, some of the grammar lessons are a little technical for language learners. So the lesson here is to test your pedagogical materials on people who know nothing about the language. Can they make heads or tails of it? Can they figure out what's going on? I think the textbook could have benefited from more testing, but as I described later, adequate testing would have been quite time consuming. In terms of content, early chapters tended to follow lessons we tested at winter immersion and summer camps, things like greetings, colors, and numbers. But we went deeper in each chapter than what we would normally do at a summer camp. So for instance, the numbers chapter contained not only numbers, but dates, months, days of the week, how to talk about math in Tunica, how to talk about birthdays and how old you are. And as you can see, the colors lesson was contained in a larger chapter on adjectives. Grammar sections were very involved and technical. We felt we needed to get really sort of in the weeds a little bit to explain, again, some of the nuances of Tunica that aren't present or understandable really from just using, English. The textbook includes more information than we'd be able to teach and test on people who weren't involved with the working group. So the lesson is to design your content around the lessons you've tested wherever possible, and test those lessons outside the group. Make sure that at least for early lessons, people who have no idea what Tunica is can understand what you're trying to teach them about the language. The group was making decisions about the language while the textbook was being written, and this caused a bit of an issue with things needing to be rewritten. Trying to hit a moving target is pretty difficult when you're writing a language textbook. Here's something that showed up in the meeting minutes. Anything that I quote here is from meeting minutes. So make a document that has recent grammatical changes that the textbook needs to be checked for. And that was added to several times and required, this was pretty late in the game in terms of how much we'd done with the textbook. So there was a lot to look over and check. So if you're working on a language that is in flux, make big decisions about language planning before getting too involved in writing the textbook. It sort of went hand in hand here, which made it difficult in some ways and sort of also allowed it to build off each other in a way. But it also made the process of writing and publishing the textbook a little more time consuming. Artwork was a huge issue that we weren't really aware was going to be, I think, as big of an issue as it was. So we started out just throwing in some clip art from the internet, but were these images licensed? Were they any good? Would the community respond to them? Did we like them? And we wanted to create artwork that we knew we owned. The publisher, this was another thing, when we sent the first draft into the publisher, they loved the pictures and they wanted more pictures. They wanted a lot more pictures. And so we had to find a way, again, pretty late in the game, to find someone who could draw all those extra pictures. This was all being done on a volunteer basis. I don't think we had very many people who were really gung-ho about drawing that many pictures. So who do you get to do the drawings in a situation like that? Anyone you can. We had to pull from everywhere, had to get as many. Well, we talked to a lot of people about drawing things. So we talked to colleagues of a couple of Dr. Maxwell's colleagues, drew some pictures. members of the project who could draw, drew some. Relatives of a member drew actually a bunch of pictures. So if illustrations are needed, try to have that scope of how many you need worked out ahead of time, which wasn't really possible because we didn't really know that would be something that the publisher thought we should do more of. And then we eventually agreed was the right move. But we had to really scramble. The person who drew the first pictures, we didn't really feel like, we could ask her to make that many more pictures. So you can talk about consistency of illustration. You can see there are different illustration styles of this is 3 of the 5 artists who contributed to the textbook, and you can see the difference. But I think all in all, it holds together pretty well, and I think it works. So the chapter order, this was another thing that caused major concerns. It was one of the hardest decisions, and it resulted in multiple reorganizations. Again, comments from the meeting minutes. Colors and compounds slated for chapter 21 have been moved to chapter 11. Andrew will go through the textbook and create a running list of vocab that students have learned so that we can make sure that examples use vocab students know. Anytime you move chapters around, you have to fully determine whether or not only the vocabulary you use in the dialogues, but the vocabulary you use in the exercises is all vocabulary that the student has seen before. So anytime you move a chapter, especially if you move a chapter, back from 21 to 11, that chapter now has access to a more limited set of words. And so you have to completely check it and modify it based on what came before. Chapters were written by different people, sometimes without complete knowledge of what vocabulary would be covered in previous chapters. So that was another reason we had to go through and try to make sure things were consistent and built off each other. And again, vocabulary had to be completely revamped every time we changed the order. So if possible, plan the book out in advance, get together, sort of write the outlines of the chapters, and then figure out what vocabulary to put in each chapter to build up as you go through. And talking about consistency, again, with art styles, but also with all the text. Many different people are contributing. There may be issues of inconsistent voice, inconsistent style, issues of consistent terminology. We created a style sheet in 2015, so that's 3 years into the project, but our adherence was spotty, and we revised it in 2018 and then later in 2020. So we needed to go through and make some pretty significant edits to, which words are bolded, which words are emphasized. How do we, is all our terminology in order? Do we use the same term for the same feature every time? So commit to a style before beginning, and really commit to it unless there's a serious oversight that needs changes. Software is huge, again. Collaboration, we definitely benefited from a lot of software design for collaboration. So Google Docs and Google Drive was great for collaborating on chapters, because the project is has 2 central locuses. So it's located in 2 places. It's Tulane and New Orleans. Most of the Tunica project most of the tribal members who work on the language are in Marksville. It's about 3 hours away. So a lot of video conferencing, a lot of using Google Docs for collaboration. So different authors use different formatting, and it had to be made to, comport with the style guide. Microsoft SharePoint was used for the final document, but see a couple slides in, this would have to change. SharePoint is nice because it gives you a revision history, and you can go back to previous version of the document if mistakes were made. Publishing. When do you publish? You publish when the book is done, right? But when is the book done? There were two camps here, I think. I think that we had some disagreements that we eventually, came to consensus on. But do we print copies locally and test them out in the classroom and figure out where things work and where things don't, and correct the errors and points of confusion, then print it again and do the same thing again until there are no major points of confusion or pain points? Publish as soon as feasible was the other one. It's usable now. It's a great accomplishment. Get it out into the world, get it out to community members, and they will all have the same copy of the book that will be, this is how Tunica is taught at this moment. So the issue with the first one is it's hard to teach the entirety of the book in a reasonable amount of time to someone who doesn't know about Tunica and has that time to dedicate. This is 21 or 22 chapters of pretty dense content that teaches a lot and would probably be, at least, I would think, a crash course. You could do it in a semester, but probably more like a year. And we didn't have anyone at that time who could do a crash course like that and get it published in the way that people wanted it published. The problem with the other one is there's a possibility of errors and subsequent changes. And if you print it with a publisher, it might be harder to submit to them a new edition with corrections and get that one printed and have people in your community buy the second edition. So again, academic press, self-published. Academic press, you could get help with proofreading, at least of the English part. Obviously not the Tunica part for obvious reasons. They can help you ensure consistency a little bit, at least again in the English part. There's more prestige, and prestige can sometimes matter in revitalization contexts where, this shouldn't be the way it is, but some people think of, language as more valuable if it has been sort of signed off on by something like an academic press. But it takes longer to get published and harder to create a second edition. If it's self-published, you can iterate more quickly, create a new version if it's print on demand, but the proofreading must be done in-house and there is less prestige. So we decided to go with the academic press. We did get help with proofing and consistency. Obviously, can't get help with Tunica proofing and consistency, and there was no typesetting or formatting help offered. So we have to go back to software. So how to typeset. Originally, we were typesetting in Microsoft Word. It's easily edited. Everyone knows how to use it. But everyone doesn't know how to use it with styles and making sure that everything's consistent. And people were working on their own chapters in their own versions of Microsoft Word, using their own conventions and their own table styles and things of that nature. And that means that what you get is a mishmash of different styles and formatting, which doesn't look consistent. It doesn't necessarily look professional. But on an even more sort of basic level, the amount of images and tables that were included in this 100, 200, and 300 page document, Microsoft had a hard time with it. It slowed to a crawl when it was all in one document, and we needed it to be in one document, and it got harder and harder to work with. We wanted it in one document so we could easily see the progression of the vocabulary and making sure that everything worked well. So what were our alternatives? Well, I was familiar with LaTeX. It's built for typesetting. Macros can ensure consistency. I had previous experience, and it comes with plenty of regret. Here is what the textbook looks like under the scenes. It is intensely hard to read code. A lot of it I sort of cobbled together. It's not really built to make a language textbook. Only I could edit it because no one else was super familiar with LaTeX. And I had to create, again, custom macros. It was very temperamental. Any mistake in formatting syntax and the whole thing fails to compile, you have to find an error. It's like programming. And it's, again, not designed to work with images. There was a lot of fiddling around with images to get it to work right. So it did give a consistent look. It was possibly easier to compile an index and a glossary once we were done and to make it look really nice. But the lesson is that it is not the answer. Word may not be the answer either. And if you know the answer, please let me know, because it was a very, very, very intense process of figuring out how to do it, and how to make sure that everything worked. And I don't think that I could do it again, rather than, let alone would I do it again. So let me know. And that's all I have. I would love to take your questions, and I can show you around the textbook a little bit, or around the code, or have, anything you want to know. I would love to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you would like to ask something, please raise your hand or type your question in the chat or put your name in the chat and I'll call on you. Andrew, do you want to stop sharing your screen just so we can
Sure.
see the full
Yes.
gallery of people?
1 second. Sorry, my mouse is
Yeah.
disappeared here. Oops. There we go.
Okay, we're still
Stop.
there. Okay, any questions? I have a couple here, but if anybody has a question to start us off, please raise your hand. Maybe while people are thinking, I'll ask one of my questions. One question I had that I know has confronted other people creating grammars of non-Indo-European languages, non-global languages, is that sometimes things that are considered basic grammar in most language classrooms are not basic in, in a endangered language. And I'm thinking of like for Yurok, that they have number classes. And so teaching the numbers is not basic, and it's usually the thing that happens in the first week in most language classes. Did you encounter anything like that where like there was an expectation that something should come early on in the grammar teaching and it just needed to be later, or
Yeah,
there was a conflict?
I think what a lot of people who are, first language English speakers are, um, basic verb inflection is not that difficult. Um, in Tunica, it's a little bit more complicated, especially because there's gender in second person, which causes a lot of issues for people. And even in lesson one, the greeting sequence, which normally in English would be very simple. There's only one option. And even, we've lost our case system so much, or yeah, that there's no difference between plural and singular you. And here you've got to make like a, there's also dual. So you've got to make like a, 6-way differentiation rather than just how are you doing. So something like that was very, very basic.
Great. See, Pat has her hand up, so I will call on her. Anyone else who wants to ask a question, raise your hand or put it in the chat. But Pat, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for your discussion and your having talked about many of the challenges that many of the rest of us face too. One of the questions that I have, because I deal with languages that, well, one of the languages I deal with has no longer any fluent speakers, and it's a huge challenge when your documentation is, of course, a fixed data set. And the language is in flux. And so one of my questions that I have to navigate is tensions within the community, often generational tensions between a very conservative, archivally based use of data versus the evolution. And some things, in my experience, are easier to cope with than others. So lexical innovation, following certain patterns that are well established in the language, is relatively easy to discuss and resolve, as opposed to morphosyntactic change. And I'm wondering just what kinds of discussions you've had and what kinds of strategies you have worked with in your discussions with respect to how to incorporate that.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, the two principles are, again, the very tension between the ease of learning maybe and and hewing more closely to the documentation. Even lexical innovations caused a little bit of tension, just depending on what sort of methods they used. There were some that we could create fairly easily by using compounding, which was a very well attested method of lexical creation. But there are some things, for new ideas where we had to do a lot of sort of metaphorical things for, uh, like anything involving electricity. We had to use the word for lightning. But yeah, morphosyntactic stuff is difficult. There's been some simplification in certain instances that has been sort of it's ruffled some feathers with some members of, not necessarily, well, it's ruffled some feathers. And I guess the way we get around it is by constantly talking about it. I mean, in a way, it's both. There's not as much of a generational difference because no one is a first language speaker and no one remembered much of it. So in that instance, there's no like authority figure to be conservative, but there certainly are concerns in the community about whether or not the language that they're going to be speaking is the language that their ancestors spoke. That is something that I've definitely heard. And what I actually did my dissertation on was basically doing a quantitative analysis of language variation, like how much did the language vary among those last speakers where there was documentation. And my hope was and is that showing that there was in fact wild variation in terms of how the language was used, what sort of inflection they put on verbs, or how often they used certain discourse markers. It varied widely. And so the hope is that we can both show that what we've got is based in the documentation, but that there have been some changes, but nothing even approaching the amount of variation that we saw, perhaps in terms of how often things were used or what sort of constructions were used.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you explicitly incorporate discussion of variance and discussion of variance through a historical timeline, or do you really deal with a current synchronic set of variants?
Well, I think for most of the project, we were working almost exclusively just off of Mary Haas's documentation. It wasn't until later on that we started to incorporate more of Gatchett and Swanton's work. But there is evidence of variation even within that single speaker who worked with Mary Haas in terms of how he said certain words, and some he would metathesize the consonants. And the group has taken that as license in some instances to use that as a way of, designing words that don't already exist. They're related, but they undergo this metathesis. But yes, there is explicit discussion, I think, within the group of the variation that occurred throughout history.
Right. May I ask, is there explicit discussion within the textbook itself? And presentation?
Don't think there is.
Okay.
I don't believe, no, there's not.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the idea there, I think, was that we wanted to put forth just, this is the way that we are teaching this language. And I honestly, I didn't finish my dissertation until 2022, which was, the same year we, or was it 2023? Time flies. But was the same year that the textbook was published. So we didn't know exactly how much variation there was, because we were working so much from Mary Haas that no one had looked quantitatively anyway at how much variation.
Well, let me just say I really appreciate the kind of challenges that this work entails. Thank you.
You're welcome.
For all of the work that you've done in this regard. I have another question, but perhaps I'll turn it over to you and Ruth to field some of the questions, and then you can come back to me and I'll pose my other questions. Thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, we have a few hands up. Megan Mills had their hand up first, so you can go unmute yourself and ask your question. And then David, Brian, and Cosette.
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering about the decision-making process itself. You mentioned once or twice coming to a consensus. And so I was wondering if the group worked to set up norms of decision-making for some of those difficult situations, or if there was any other insight you can give into that type of process.
I don't think there's anything sort of official or written about the sort of process of decision making. I think what we normally do is we have like a robust discussion over video conference. Ideas are put forth, and then we sort of give our seal of approval like one by one and figure out where everybody stands. And find some sort of compromise and consensus. I think we keep a very long issues and solutions document that is still being worked on, and I would say it's contested within the group about what those solutions will be for all the issues that we have. But eventually, after putting forth these ideas, again, we don't follow Robert's Rules of Order or anything super formal. But I think that compromise comes from the types of discussion we have over video chat.
Thank you.
Dave Prine, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hey, Andrew, great to see you. It's great to see you with so much hair because I know you pulled most of it out during this process. But yeah, so if you can find a way to reach through the computer and sign my copy, I would love that. But until then, I'll just ask my question. How has the reception been, both with the physical book and with digital copies? Because I have to admit that after this came out, I noticed on certain digital book platforms like Scribd and Everland and Hoopla, I noticed that this thing popped up everywhere. I would do a search for like Welsh language, and suddenly it's Tunica language. And so this really started showing up everywhere digitally for me. And so I'm just curious if that's been a boon, or if there's been any noticeable difference with the digital copies being accessed, and just how the physical copy has been received.
Well, I know that that the tribe has given copies of the book to tribal families. I don't know too much about what happened once the book went out the door. I know that there are people who are in Marksville and probably have a better idea about that who are here. If any of you want to field the question, I would love that. But yeah, I really once the publication went out the door, I needed a break. I didn't really look at much of what happened for a little bit. Elizabeth, Rebecca, do you have any answers to that? I'm sure we can. All right, I guess not.
Okay. Well, T-Koch.
There is another question about in the chat. Have you received feedback that will be incorporated into the next edition?
There has certainly been feedback. I know that the language continues to evolve. I know that decisions continue to be made. I know that that people who are involved with the project find certain parts of the book outdated. I don't know that we've done much in the way of thinking about a second edition. Again, people who are more involved currently with that. I think most of what we've done is start to concentrate on a second textbook that deals with more advanced topics. But I would be all for a second edition of this one. And yeah, and I think iteration in a project like this is extremely important because again, we're hitting a moving target. We're learning things about the language, and the pedagogy is going to change and evolve.
I don't see any other hands up or questions in the chat. So, Pat, do you want to ask your follow-up question?
Thanks very much, Ruth. One of the other questions I have is with respect to data sovereignty and copyright. And I'm wondering what discussions there have been within the community and within the collective group of people who've authored this in various ways about copyright. Those can be very complex issues. And when you mention digital platforms, do you have sound files on those platforms, and what policies and protocols are in place given the availability of the community's language through the publication of this?
The community, at least the group of the Tunica Language Working Group, seems to be largely of one mind in terms of, we want to have this be out there. We want people to know about that our language is here, that it's, being revitalized. I think that there are sound files. Those are hosted by Indiana University. There's a link to them, and there's a QR code, I believe, for them in the book, or at least there's URLs. And I believe those are publicly accessible. And I don't think there's been, the copyright remains with the tribe. So that was an important aspect of getting this published, is that the copyright, I believe, did stay with the tribe. But in terms of, public versus private and how much should this be, promulgated, I haven't heard anything about tribal members or anyone thinking that that access should be controlled.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes left.
I just want to say really quickly, oh, Elizabeth, do you want to say yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I just wanted to speak a little bit on, how we use the textbook within the community, and, how we're currently distributing it to tribal families. We teach language classes weekly. This past fall, I'd been teaching ages 5 to 10, beginner 1 level, Tunica, and my coworker Ryan Lopez, he's been teaching 14 plus. So that, that's the teen adult class. Also beginner 1 level. In Ryan's class, he directly shares chapters, or I'm sorry, in the past, he had shared chapters, and myself as well, and in other classes I've shared chapters, but now that we have the textbook, any students that register for the classes, they get a free copy of the textbook. And in Ryan's classes, what I wanted to say that, he'll reference specific chapters for certain classes. So that's how we're using, the textbook today. And going back to, I'd mentioned this, privately to Andrew, but going back to, testing the textbook, our tribe was funded by ANA, and that was between 2018, 2001, and we were funded for a second time between 2021 and 2024, and that was for a mentor apprentice program. During that time, we were piloting the textbook with our apprentices, our language and teacher apprentices, and they would provide feedback to the working group, as the textbook was being edited. So just to give you, a better idea of what we were doing on a community side, Rebecca may be able to add to that as well.
Hey, yeah. I guess too recently under the most recent ANA grant, we've been piloting out the second textbook, which would just be a continuation, getting into more advanced, not necessarily a second edition. We've been piloting out with the I guess assistant language instructors in the class with them to try to also make sure that it's understandable to people who were at that level coming into the second textbook. So that's been part of it. In terms of kind of piloting out those topics, we will also pilot out those particular lesson objectives in classrooms and see how the teaching of that works, and that will also help us inform the way that we are shaping some lessons in the second textbook. So that's it.
We had a request in the chat for more about the book, especially the lesson index. Excuse me. So I've posted in the chat most of the lesson index. Hold on, let me get the last bit. There we go. So yeah, there's 20 chapters of hopefully increasing difficulty, allowing us to sort of go through and teach up. Hopefully anyone can learn it, even if there's no teacher. That would be really lovely. I don't know if anybody has done that, but we'll find out.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to Elizabeth and Rebecca as well for adding your perspective from the community on how this is being used. And thank you to everybody who attended and your great questions. We really appreciate you joining us this afternoon and hope that you'll come back next month to talk with Jessica Locklear.